outcomes, each of the outcomes that we look at offers different understandings about the ways that racism works. So in ongoing work that I'm doing on a systematic review, looking at racism and HIV/AIDS relationships and various HIV/AIDS related outcomes, we're finding, for instance, that with some forms of racism, the consequences, in particular if people perceive racism, might actually have benefits. What am I saying? Am I saying racism is good? No. What I am saying is that people who, so far from what we've been able to see, people who perceive racism might actually be more proactive in engaging in preventive behaviors. And if we think about that for a moment, that makes sense. So for instance, if I perceive that my environment is not a safe one for me, I might not want to wait until I have to rely on the healthcare system that I don't trust to ensure my well-being. I think I think I want to just ask a couple of questions and then I'll close. So what I've shared with you today is based on critical race theory, right? So the understandings about race as a social construct, ethnicity also as a social construct, the call to take our work beyond simply publishing papers and think about what does it mean to do something with it in the field. They all draw on something called the public health critical race praxis, which merges the sort of unwieldy critical race approaches that originated in law with the empirical methods of public health. I'd say that one thing that we need to do as a field is improve our measures of real-world racism exposures. Think about assessing biomarker outcomes. I offer that with a little bit of hesitancy because I feel like now everything is biomarker, right? And so to think about how can we incorporate additional outcomes into the studies that we do. And we need to develop new statistical tools to be able to move to the higher levels of the socioecologic framework and capture what I call social etiology, right? The mechanisms by which social contexts and macro level factors end up actually producing particular outcomes in individuals and populations and patterns in populations. We also need to think about the life course, right? So much of the ways that we think about racism right now are very cross-sectional. Increasingly we have some longitudinal stuff, but what does it mean to think about what's happened to my family? Also thinking about historical trauma, which is not exactly life course, but what does it mean to have been part of an ethnically defined group or a nation and to experience inequalities, major social injustices, such as those imposed on the indigenous populations of this continent. And how can we measure these things in ways that can get published in the highest tier journals in our field? Another crucial issue, intersectionality. A person is not simply one or another social category, right? So a person is not just her race or her gender. These things interlock in complex ways that cannot be disentangled easily. How do we measure them in our studies, right? And it's possible that if we're thinking about racism effects, that the ways that racism matters most are tied to something other than an explicitly defined racial category. Maybe it has to do with a subset of a racial group. Maybe it's just black men, for instance, or a particular kind of black men for whom the racism effect is really salient. And are there some aspects of identity that we should count more than others, right? A kind of weighting of identity components. So questions for you. We've been thinking about how do we advance the study of racism when racism is so often treated like a sort of a typical risk factor, right? As a hazard that people can be taught to avoid, for instance, rather than as something that structures not only health outcomes out there, and we can see it in our population patterns, but also we researchers exist within a society that's racialized. So our research, our thinking too, is colored by racial stratification. How can we account for that and still be counted as doing solid empirical work? And then secondly, how can we advance anti-racism approaches when there is an assumption that empirical research is inherently objective? And I've used the term the religion of science. And I've used it kind of, tongue-in-cheek, but, I think we do really need to think about what does it mean to study something like racism. I don't think we can do it by treating it as simply an objective endeavor. I think we'll have to acknowledge subjectivities that feed into it, our own personal subjectivities, and the ways that the field might receive and work with this, and the implications for our broader communities. Okay, thank you.